To finish up, I want to sort of give a couple of overview perspectives on this episode. One of those perspectives is to sort of talk about the historical constants that we can see in the global financial crisis. Now, it's important sort of to include a caveat here. Me sitting here now and saying, look, we can see historical constants in the global financial crisis doesn't mean that a lot of economists actually picked the global financial crisis. In fact, there were very few. Economists like Nouriel Roubini and Raghuram Rajan being honourable exceptions. So, it's important to say that it's after the fact that I'm saying, look, we can see these historical constants. One of the historical constants, though, is the idea that this financial crisis was preceded by strong credit growth. And since the global financial crisis, there's been an important set of studies done by Morris Shularik and Alan Taylor, which has looked at this issue of the relationship between credit growth and financial crisis. And as this quote from one of their studies says, from a study of financial crisis in 14 developed countries from 1870 to 2008, you can conclude that past growth of credit emerges as the single best predictor of financial instability. And so in the global financial crisis, we had that credit growth, large inflow of capital from China and Asia, then made available to the housing sector, and the effect multiplied through the leveraging sort of activity that was going on at the time. Secondly, whenever you have these crises, you always seem to observe sort of an upsurge in the preparedness to take risks. And so Diamond and Rajan here say investment in mortgage-backed securities seem to be part of a culture of excessive risk-taking that had overtaken banks. A third feature, I think, which is a common feature of financial crises often, and in particular when there are banking panics, is, and this is a point emphasised by the economic historian Gary Gorton, is the idea that there's a common feature which is lending being financed by demand deposits, so that there's a mismatch, if you like, between the sort of maturity of lending and borrowing, that people who've loaned to the banks have this right to sort of demand their money straight away. Yet usually a bank will have invested that money in longer term ventures. And so if enough depositors come to a bank and say, we want our money out, it's inevitably going to mean that the bank is not able to realise sort of enough of those assets or realise them in a way that allows them to remain solvent. And again, that's a big aspect of what happened during this global financial crisis. And Gorton says a systemic financial crisis is an event in which the banking system is insolvent, which means that debt contracts which cannot be honoured with cash because assets cannot be sold. And that's because of this mismatch in maturity. The assets are longer term. It's also because it's a systemic crisis. And so if you try and sell your assets, then you're selling at a time when everyone else is trying to sell, so it's going to be a fire sale. The fourth aspect is regulation. That periods of financial crises tend to be periods when regulation and policy is most lax. And certainly the global financial crisis was a time when there'd been an increase in banking competition and unwinding of a lot of the regulations from, say, Glass-Steagall that had been implemented in the US in the Great Depression, which led to this search for yield, and also an expansion in the scope of activities allowed. So when we look at the global financial crisis and compare to other episodes, I do think we see this historical constants. And hopefully that allows us to do a better job of recognising that these episodes might be underway next time they come around. Some final thoughts. When you read sort of a lot of the literature on the global financial crisis, it's not uncommon in some popular accounts to sort of demonise particular people. I think that there are obviously some people in this episode who might have done deeds that we don't regard as particularly honourable, but I don't think it's right to regard this as an episode because there just happened to be a lot of bad people at Wall Street. This was an episode which is about bad governance and regulation that allows particular people to undertake particular types of activities. So, we can't dismiss this episode as saying, well, look, if we get rid of those bad people, it won't happen again. We need to think about restoring good governance and regulation of financial markets. We also should understand by now that unregulated financial markets don't work. But the history of attempts to regulate them, for example, before the global financial crisis, shows that any policymaker who tries to do this has to be aware that the financial sector is tough and relentless in pursuing its own interests, which often contradict the idea of imposing more governance or regulation. The third idea is that the episode of Lehman Brothers failing really establishes, I think, that in the modern economy, the banking sector is, if not too big, then definitely too interconnected to fail. It's difficult to think of any government around the world after Lehman Brothers in the next decade or so deliberately allowing a large financial institution to fail. So that means essentially we as taxpayers are providing an insurance policy to banks if they get into trouble. And so I think governments really need to be thinking about what's the quid pro quo for the provision of this implicit insurance to the banking sector. The final thing is that herd mentality. If you read accounts of the global financial crisis, you'll find there was a lot of people who might have had some misgivings, but basically who were swept along, versus those who stood against the herd. And so I think the global financial crisis is a really interesting episode for understanding about the way in which herd mentality can affect economic activity, but also about the characters or the characteristics of people who stood against the herd, and what that might imply about the way we need to foster sort of particular type of information from different sources in policy making, in thinking about the course of economic activity. In the next section of this lecture, I'm going to go on to talk about a first main theme overarching this period, which is to do with globalization.